One of the things that I feel so blessed by is the fact that in my 40s, my husband and I received the gift of two daughters, 3 years apart, but we traveled to China twice to adopt our daughters, and so God has blessed us with that gift. I have an 11-year-old. She is the very classic, compliant, Han Chinese DNA child. And I have a 9-year-old who is of Mongolian descent. And there surely is some of Genghis Khan running through her veins. So, quick story, I was completely immersed in this presentation the other morning. And in fact, to the avoidance of my children, I was trying to get this done. And out of the corner of my eye, as I'm working on this presentation, I see my 9-year-old headed for the door to get on the bus. And I caught her with her hand on the door, only to notice that she was wearing, and I really am very embarrassed about this, a black spaghetti strap shirt, some black shiny boots, and worst of all, the Daisy Duke shorts that I had thrown out at the end of the summer, which surely she had pulled out of the trash just for the occasion when I would not be looking. I was mortified. Now, I'm not a very contemporary parent. Another parent would have said, Lillian, do you think you're appropriately dressed for school? And no, motivated by the work that I was doing on this presentation, and knowing very well what my parents would have said to me if I was trying to get out the door wearing that, I said, Lillian May Moore, change or die. Don't call the social workers. We're going to shift gears quite a bit. So every year, the Giving Institute out of Chicago conducts research on charitable giving. And annually, they publish their data in an analysis called Giving USA. And those of you who have been engaged in fundraising are very familiar with this publication. Their most recent publication was released just a couple of months ago, and it contains some very good news about charitable giving. And I'm going to share a lot of slides with you here, forgive me. But one of the things that you will see here is that we've got two trend lines, or two lines, if you will, from the past 40 years. The gray line is current dollars, and the gold line is inflation-adjusted dollars. And you can see here that the total giving to all types of charitable organizations in inflation-adjusted dollars has nearly tripled over the last 40 years. Now, you can also see here the big dip that charitable giving took after 2007, but the good news is that by 2014 now, total giving has reached its highest mark in all of history. So donors are returning to their pre-recession giving priorities. And there is more good news. So in this chart, the blue bars represent total giving, and then the orange bar represents giving by, for the religious subsector, all right? During the past 40 years, in inflation-adjusted dollars, total giving to religious organizations has doubled from about $57 billion to $115 billion. And in fact, giving to religious organizations reached its highest point ever in 2014. That's more good news. Also noteworthy is the fact that giving to religion dropped less during the most recent recession than any other category. In this category, there are about 300,000 organizations, and that includes primarily houses of worship, but also in this category called religion, we have our Bible camps, our youth ministry organizations, basically any of the organizations that are concerned for shaping the faith. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about bad news. There's bad news, and you might look at this chart and say, oh, that's not bad news. I see religion there for 32% of the pie. The bad news is that for decades, religion was 50% of that pie. Half of all gifts in this country were given for religious purposes. And so even though total giving to religion reached its highest historical point last year, the giving to religion category experienced the least growth this last year. Since its high point in 1985 and 1987, there's been a dramatic drop. That's that gray line that you see going down against the blue line going up. And today, only about a third of all charitable giving benefits religion. Why? Well, Giving USA would give us these reasons. They would say that broad demographic changes in religious affiliation are one major concern. We have the rise of the nuns as we talk about it, as we speak about it. In other words, we have fewer members, and we're very much a membership-based approach to giving in our church. And then we have decline in attendance. In other words, there isn't as much volume in the offering plate, and we've been an offering plate-based kind of subsector. And then the third piece is that we have a rise in religiously oriented nonprofits. Nonprofits organizations have risen faster than any other sector of organizational life over the last 20-some years, and we have many more religious organizations that have been founded. So it's possible that people are now giving what they used to give to the congregation to some of these religious-based organizations. What Giving USA doesn't say in its analysis of this data, but what I am positive is true, is that probably the primary reason that this line is going down is because no one is asking. Okay? Don't clap yet. You might take issue with me. No one is asking. And no one, of course, is a very broad-based term. But I want to show you that by comparison, all of these other subsectors are continuing to grow. They're receiving a growing piece of the charitable giving pie. So we have to ask the question, what are they doing that the church and our congregations are not doing? Well, they're inviting gifts. People like me have been working in those sectors for 30-plus years, inviting gifts. They're using the tools of philanthropy. And so now the really bad news. What happens if this downward trend continues? Okay, there's the trend. Let's look at what happens if it continues. So the trend line for religious giving from its highest point in 1987 forward. If that pattern continues, giving to religion as a percent of total giving in this country continues to 0 by 2051. If the pattern continues, then if I die at age 90, charitable giving to religion will die with me. I have not spent my whole vocation working toward that end. And so this sharp decline in religious giving begs a really important question. One of the questions that the Siebert Foundation begs us to ask. Do we change how we approach charitable giving in the church? Or do we stand by and watch our ministries die for a lack of resources? Let's go back to the gray trend line. What it means for our children and our children's children should shake us out of our apathy and inspire real urgency for some major and immediate changes in our approach to giving. Giving is growing. The blue line is charitable giving in this country. The capacity for generosity is out there. But like my Lillian, ministry isn't dressed for the occasion. We have such a limited view of our donors as our members who attend. We've been so afraid to expand our approach beyond the offering plate that we're killing ministry's opportunity to thrive in the midst of the most generous time in human history. These are perhaps harsh words, but I want to share them with you. So what does it mean? How shall we dress? Into what shall we change? I think the Apostle Paul tells us precisely what to wear at times like this. It's time to put on God's armor and get courageously serious about funding the work, the life-changing, life-saving work that God is doing through our churches and ministry organizations. So what should the church be learning from philanthropy? And this is where I intend to spend the rest of our time. Perhaps the most important thing the church needs to understand is that philanthropy and fundraising, or the philosophy of fundraising and philanthropy, in my opinion, is entirely compatible with Christian stewardship. Hank Rosso is considered, in my profession, the godfather of modern-day philanthropy. And I love this quote from Hank Rosso. Tell me that this isn't Christian stewardship. We might use different terms, but tell me that he's not talking about philanthropy as Christian stewardship. He says, giving is a privilege, not a nuisance or a burden. Thoughtful philanthropists see themselves as responsible stewards of life's gifts to them. I read that God's gifts to them. What they have, they hold in trust in their belief, and they accept the responsibility to share their treasures effectively through their philanthropy. Giving is an expression of thankfulness for the blessings that they have received during their lifetime. I know that that's the philosophy that anyone I work with in my field of fundraising shares. That's our philosophy. So friends, one of the points I want to make today is that fundraising's best practices don't compromise Christian stewardship. On the contrary, I hope you believe that fundraising's best practices strengthen Christian stewardship. And that's a subject and a presentation all by itself. So for the rest of our time, I am going to ask you now to put over your armor a wetsuit, because I am literally going to take a fire hose on you and give you ideas, all right? We don't have the time or the expertise in our congregations and our small ministry organizations to staff every fundraising best practice. But out of my experience, I want to offer up today just 3 what I consider to be high return on investment changes for your consideration. Yes, I went to business school and not the seminary, and so I talk about ROI all the time. I'm comfortable with that, and I hope you will be too. But if you're going to pick just one thing that you are going to do differently, I'm hoping it might be something on this list. So some strategies. And the first thing that we're going to take a quick look at is making the case for giving. So most congregations and religious organizations have made the case for giving by focusing on the tithe, focusing on proportionate giving. And I can say with a full belief and commitment to those biblical truths, how's that working for us? We know it's working in the lives of some people, but as a whole sector and across charitable giving, that's not working. 2%, we're flat. So instead, we have this trend now towards something called a narrative budget. And if you haven't checked it out, I've got a website here for you. Narrative budgets tell the story of mission and service and how varying components of your budget contribute to ministry. It's not a focus on the bottom line. Narrative budgets are more likely to make an inspirational case for support. So if you'd like to learn more about how narrative budgets work, there's your website right there. So congregations primarily have long relied on their worship services and their newsletters to tell their ministry stories and make their case, right? We've used periodic, weekly, and monthly approaches to making our case. Well, now our millennials are teaching us that the episodic, real-time storytelling to make our case works far better, all more effective, all the more valuable. So technology has opened the door for more people to share more stories of ministry more often with a much broader audience than simply our membership. Now you and your staff might faithfully be trying to control every message that's out there about your congregation or your ministry. We have to give that up and trust that God works through others as well to tell these stories. But why might you be more interested in the digital stories that your members and neighbors and others are sharing? Why would you care about that more? Why should that be more important? Pardon? God's at work in their lives. Amen. And God also must have invented the internet and all of these other digital opportunities. God's at work in their lives too, and they have their stories, and they will tell their stories probably far more effectively. And you know what? The reader will trust their story more. Do you see this Nielsen survey? I'm not sure, again, to the extent that you can actually read it, but the very top response in the Nielsen survey reminds us that a referral, a story, a recommendation from a peer is the thing that we all trust the most. We trust it far more than anything that an organization or an institution is pushing out at us. Let's look for a minute at gifts beyond the offering plate. So bringing our gifts to the altar has been an act of worship from the beginning of time. I could never imagine compromising that. I confess I am an automated giver in every other way, shape, and form except for my Sunday offering, which is brought to the church and brought to the altar. But that's just me, and it might be you, and it's not likely to be the way that new donors will use to support our mission. Thanks to the development of new techniques, we now have far more than 3 ways to give. And while online and digital gifts still represent a relatively small piece of gift income, this form of giving is growing at double-digit rates, and it's projected to grow faster than any other form of giving. So recent research also suggests that the online giver is more likely to give double that of the offline giver over their lifetime. We can't afford not to get our digital game on. Right? And if you don't know how to do it, look at somebody younger than you. They can likely help you figure it out. So new technologies have made it easier to make gifts of cash anytime from virtually any device. The QR code. I went to my sister's very rural church in northwestern Minnesota and opened the bulletin and found a QR code so I could make my gift. Text your gift. I was telling Pastor Jeske that I happened to be listening to Time of Grace the other morning. He was talking about Ezekiel. I happened to be studying Ezekiel, and I also noted that there was an opportunity somewhere during the course of his presentation, of his homily, to text my gift, okay? The kiosk reader. I'm a member of a very traditional church in the Minneapolis area. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called Mount Olivet Lutheran Church. Even formal Mount Olivet now has a kiosk at the back of the church at the information center so that I can go and do just about anything I want, including making my gift. And then, of course, Facebook has just launched its Donate Now button. You'll see that showing up. Now, in a few minutes, you'll have the chance to hear from Tim Schwan, and when you'll get a few more ideas about how some of these new technologies are working in real life. One of the other things I want to introduce you to is this concept, and I won't say much about it because you can visit with Brian Becker from Wheat Ridge. He's here, and he can tell you more about it. It's this crowdfunding idea, and most likely you had never heard that term until somebody challenged you to dump a bucket of ice over your head for the ALS challenge, right? That's crowdfunding. Well, Wheat Ridge Ministries has recognized the potential for this approach, and they've recently created a program called We Raise. It's a program and a platform for crowdfunding. And I just want to point out that there is a couple of free online seminars coming up that will teach you all about it. I don't need to tell you anything more about that today. But this is exciting stuff, and it has all kinds of application for you. Another thing about gifts. Speaking of buckets and the ALS challenge, so far we've been talking about gifts of cash, and gifts of cash are typically made out of people's regular income. However, we know that wealth is not held in cash, right? It's held in assets. And if you're only inviting gifts from that cash bucket, you are asking from the small bucket, right? If your ministry isn't actively inviting gifts from the big bucket, the asset bucket, other organizations are. And they're going to receive them. So ministry can't afford to only be inviting gifts from the small bucket. We have to be inviting gifts from the big bucket as well. And I could spend a whole lot of time telling you about each one of these opportunities in the big bucket From the IRA to the farmland to the life insurance to your home to stock, countless assets that people can use to give creatively. I spend most of my time doing that very work. And so my point, again, is this. We have to get courageously serious about gifts beyond the offering plate. The small bucket, especially the big bucket. So asset stewardship and the wealth transfer. Let's take a closer look at the opportunity that we have here right in front of us. I'm going to pop a few numbers now in front of you. Who knows right off the top of their head what that number is? We don't see that every day. Thank you. Somebody recognized it. 59 trillion. According to Boston University's periodic research, the projected intergenerational wealth transfer is 59 trillion between 2007 and 2061. During that same period of time, 6.3 trillion will transfer at death to charity. Lifetime giving during that period will yield an additional 20.6 trillion for charity. Now, if our religious giving trend line continues, I suspect that religion will receive about 15% of this transfer. Remember, we used to receive 50. And that 15% would be half again of what we're receiving now. 8% of Lutherans include their congregation among their estate beneficiaries. That's up from 5% less than 10 years ago. And that average bequest value is up from $10,000 less than 10 years ago. And since my information is already old and goes back to, I think, 2010 from my days with the ELCA, I fully anticipate that that average bequest value is even higher. So the propensity for Lutherans to make these gifts is increasing. In fact, here's the bequest data from Giving USA that was just published. Last year, bequests alone grew by 15.5%. The largest gifts are given at death with very little signal from lifetime giving behavior other than loyalty. So you can look around your congregation. You can see the people who are regularly there. You can see the consistent giving. It doesn't have to be large. And you can see your prospect pool right in front of you. Remember, the wealth transfer will happen. It is happening. We're at the beginning of the curve, and your eldest members are a part of it. Do they want the church to be here 30, 40, 50 years from now for their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren? You betcha. That's the number one reason that they will make this gift. They have a desire and a need to make a legacy that matters. Will you ask for the honor of being among their beneficiaries? Will you have a plan and a process for inviting these gifts? Will you have a fund for receiving these gifts? Most typically that's an endowment, and that's yet a whole other presentation. And finally, you don't have to be an expert in charitable gift planning, but you do need to have personal relationships with people who can help you. And there's a whole list of the kinds of folks here that you want to have around your table and in your camp and working with you on your behalf. And the beautiful news is that Wisconsin is blessed with these kinds of people. I think every church body that's represented here today has active gift planners as a part of their denomination. They are there for you. You can look inside and outside your congregation and your community and find these people. They're your team. Go get them. So finally, okay, you can change out of your wetsuit now, but don't take off your armor. Keep the armor on. I'm going to close by repeating myself. It's time to put on God's armor and get courageously serious about funding the life-changing, life-saving work that God is doing through our churches and ministry organizations. And my prayer today is that you will join me. Thanks.